The Eastern Front, 1942. For the German soldiers hunkered down in their trenches, it was a sound that defied all logic of modern warfare. It began as a faint, almost pathetic sputtering drone, like a distant sewing machine. Then, just as they would strain to locate the source, the sound would abruptly die, replaced by an eerie, unsettling silence. In that silence, they would hear only the wind, a strange, soft, sweeping noise that sounded, they would later say, like a witch's broomstick sweeping across the night sky. And then, from that silent darkness, with no warning, would come the whistle of falling bombs and the violent, earth-shattering eruption of high explosives in their midst. This was the work of a weapon the Wehrmacht could not comprehend. It was not a modern bomber or a high-tech secret weapon. It was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Forces, an all-female unit flying obsolete biplanes made of wood and canvas. They were a flying anachronism, a joke that had become a terrifying reality. This is the story of how a group of young women, armed with hand-me-down planes and an unbreakable will, became one of the most feared and effective bomber units of the war. This is the story of the pilots the Germans themselves nicknamed the Nachthexen, the Night Witches. The story of the Night Witches was born from the single greatest catastrophe in Russian history, Operation Barbarossa. In the summer of 1941, Hitler's Wehrmacht smashed across the Soviet border, annihilating entire armies and pushing the Red Army to the brink of total collapse. In this desperate hour, as the nation fought for its very survival, hundreds of thousands of Soviet women volunteered to fight. But while they were accepted as medics, partisans, and even snipers, one place remained off-limits: the cockpit of a combat aircraft. The deeply ingrained sexism of the Soviet military establishment declared that a woman's place was not in the sky. This refusal was a personal insult to one woman who had more influence than any other in Soviet aviation, Marina Raskova. Raskova was a national icon, the Soviet Amelia Earhart, a record-breaking aviatrix and navigator who had been one of the first women ever to be named a hero of the Soviet Union. She was a celebrity, a skilled pilot, and she had a direct line to the one man who mattered, Joseph Stalin. As letters poured in from thousands of young female pilots who had been rejected from the front, Raskova used her fame and influence to launch a relentless campaign. She personally petitioned Stalin, arguing that it was insanity to leave thousands of skilled pilots grounded while the Luftwaffe burned the Red Air Force from the sky. In the face of catastrophic losses and Raskova's iron will, Stalin finally relented. In October 1941, he issued the order to create 3 all-female air regiments. Raskova was given the monumental task of recruiting, training, and equipping these women for war in a matter of months. Thousands of volunteers flocked to her call: university students, factory workers, and crop duster pilots, many still in their teens. They were given hand-me-down male uniforms, boots so large they had to be stuffed with newspaper, and a training regimen that was brutally compressed. In a world that had told them they couldn't, they were now being asked to do the impossible. One of these units, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, would soon be forged into a legend, a weapon of psychological terror that would earn a unique and fearsome name, not from their own commanders, but from the terrified German soldiers they were sent to hunt. When the young women of the 588th Regiment first saw their assigned aircraft, their hearts sank. It was not a modern metal monoplane. It was a Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane made of wood and canvas that had first flown in 1928. It was a trainer, a crop duster, a flying scarecrow. Its 5-cylinder engine produced a pathetic 110 horsepower, giving it a top speed slower than many of the German tanks on the ground. It carried no defensive machine guns, no armor, and no radio. Its navigation equipment consisted of a stopwatch and a map. To drop their bombs, the navigator had to lean out of the open cockpit, judge the target by eye, and pull a wire. By any rational measure, sending this machine into combat against the modern cannon-armed fighters of the Luftwaffe was a suicide mission. But the women of the 588th soon discovered that the Po-2's profound weaknesses could, under the right circumstances, be turned into deadly advantages. Its maximum speed was actually slower than the stall speed of the German Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. This meant that if a German pilot tried to tail the slow-moving biplane, he would stall and fall out of the sky, forced to make risky high-speed passes. The Po-2 was also incredibly maneuverable. It could turn on a dime, hug the terrain, and fly so low it could disappear behind a line of trees, making it an exceptionally difficult target to hit, especially at night. And the night was where it truly belonged. Its small, simple engine made a distinctive low-frequency pottering sound, like a sewing machine, that was difficult for German sound detectors to lock onto. Most importantly, it was light enough and stable enough that a skilled pilot could idle the engine completely and glide for long distances in near total silence. It was this unique characteristic that the women of the 588th would weaponize. They would take this obsolete, fragile flying machine and turn it into a ghost, a silent predator that would become the stuff of nightmares for the German soldiers on the Eastern Front. In June of 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment arrived at the front lines. The reception from their male counterparts was not a warm welcome. It was one of open mockery and derision. The male pilots, flying more advanced aircraft, dismissed them as a propaganda stunt. They called them the Dolly Partons, a dismissive nickname for their all-female status, and took bets on how long they would last. The German soldiers they were sent to attack were equally contemptuous, initially viewing the slow, clumsy biplanes as little more than a nuisance. This universal disrespect would not last long. The women of the 588th were thrown directly into the crucible of the war's most brutal theater. Their mission was harassment, to fly relentlessly, night after night, behind German lines and cause as much chaos and psychological disruption as possible. From their open cockpits, they flew through freezing rain, heavy snow, and a sky thick with German flak and night fighters. The conditions were horrific. With no enclosed canopy, the pilots would often return from missions with their faces frostbitten. Navigation was a nightmare of dead reckoning in the dark, flying low over a featureless, war-torn landscape with only a map and a stopwatch to guide them. The casualty rates were brutal. A single tracer round, a stray piece of shrapnel, could tear through the aircraft's fabric skin and kill the crew or set the entire flammable wooden frame ablaze. They had no parachutes. They had been removed to save weight, allowing them to carry 2 more small bombs. Every mission was a one-way ticket if things went wrong. On their very first night of combat, the regiment lost a crew, a devastating blow that brought home the lethal reality of their work. But they did not break. Night after night they flew, their numbers dwindling, but their skill and determination growing with every mission. They learned to use the darkness as their armor, the clouds as their shield, and the unique capabilities of their flimsy aircraft as a deadly weapon. The mockery from their male comrades soon turned to stunned silence, and then to grudging respect, as the women of the 588th began to prove that they were not just a propaganda stunt. They were one of the most effective and most feared bomber units on the entire front. The women of the 588th didn't just endure, they innovated. To survive in the lethal skies of the Eastern Front, they developed a brilliant and terrifying set of tactics. They flew exclusively at night, in formations of 3. The first 2 planes would approach the target and deliberately fly into the range of German searchlights and flak guns. As the German defenses erupted in a storm of tracers and exploding shells, focusing all their attention on these 2 decoys, the 3rd plane would approach from a different direction. A few hundred meters from the target, the pilot would cut her engine completely. In that sudden, terrifying silence, the 3rd plane became a ghost, gliding silently through the darkness towards its prey. The navigator would lean out of the cockpit, release her bombs by hand, and then the pilot would restart the engine and dive away at treetop level as the bombs erupted below. The German soldiers in their trenches were utterly unnerved by this. They would hear the faint drone of the slow-moving planes, then silence, then only the soft sweeping sound of the wind over the wings, a sound they said was like a witch's broomstick. Then, from that silent darkness, came death. It was a form of psychological warfare so effective that the Germans began to call the women of the 588th the Nachthexen, the night witches. The nickname, born of fear, was a badge of honor the pilots would wear with pride for the rest of their lives. Their operational tempo was relentless. A single crew might fly 8 to 10, sometimes even 18 missions in a single night, returning to their crude airfield only to refuel, rearm with bombs that were sometimes so large the navigator had to sit on them, and take off again. By the end of the war, the regiment had flown over 24,000 combat sorties and dropped 23,000 tons of bombs. They were so successful and so feared that any German pilot who shot one down was automatically awarded the Iron Cross. The mockery from their male comrades had long since turned to profound respect. The regiment became one of the most decorated units in the entire Soviet Air Force. Dozens of its pilots were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor for valor. These young women, university students, factory workers, and farm girls had taken an obsolete crop duster, a machine made of wood and fabric, and turned it into one of the most effective psychological weapons of the war. They fought from the skies over Stalingrad, through the brutal battles for the Crimea and Belarusia. all the way to the final apocalyptic battle for Berlin. They had answered their nation's call, defied a culture that said they didn't belong, and in the freezing, lethal darkness of the Eastern Front, they had become legends.